During the 16th and 17th century, there was a divide in Puritans over corruption in the Church of England and how it was to best be handled. Some felt that purifying the corruption and maintaining the systemic structure was the best way to carry on, but there were others who felt that the corruption went too deep and the purification wasn't happening quick enough, and so a separatist movement began with some Puritans pushing for local independent churches as opposed to all existing under the Church of England. This is where Robert Eggers' 2015 film The Witch picks up, with a family of separatists being tried for their patriarch's continuous attempts to have this community join the separatist movement and his mocking of the Church of England under which this settlement still exists and stands by.
I cannot be judged by false Christians, for I have done nothing save preach Christ's true gospel.
As they build their homestead and their new lives away from the settlement, Sam, the newest addition to their family, goes missing in a horrifying and bizarre way as their daughter Thomasin is playing with him, taken by a witch in the plain daylight, and following his disappearance, the homestead falls victim to the dark magic calling these woods home. Folklore itself has existed for as long as humans have been able to communicate stories to each other, and while today it mostly exists as nothing more than fun stories to tell around a campfire or get some insight into the functions of a particular society or culture during a period of time, during these times the subjects of folklore were not perceived as a thing of fiction, but instead as things that truly did exist within the woods and were to be feared. Witchcraft was a particularly strong and prevalent fear during this time, and eventually led to the infamous Salem witch trials that took place from 1692 to 1693. In today's stories, witches are often depicted in a humorous or fun, spooky way, which is a far cry from the horrifyingly wicked way they were seen back in these days. Robert Eggers grew up in New England in the deep historical roots of witchcraft and had a strong fear of them growing up, being exposed to more of the traditional ideas of them as opposed to what they've mostly become in fiction nowadays. Eggers' career began as a production designer for plays, and he also directed a few of his own during his early days, including a stage production of the 1922 classic Nosferatu. After having a number of pitches for feature films be unable to find funding because of how bizarre the scripts were, Eggers focused his mind on trying to create a more conventional and palatable film to begin his filmmaking career with. Because of his lifelong fascination with old school folklore and the history of witchcraft, he wrote the script for The Witch aiming to give an accurate depiction of how they were feared by society at this time. It was suggested to him that he create a short film that reflected certain elements that would be the focus of The Witch, like creepy dark forests and working with younger actors. His short film Brothers was made as a proof of concept to attract investors, and it's a really interesting watch for those interested in this sort of thing. I won't spoil it here though, because I want to do a video going over all of the short films Eggers has made because they're really fun to look at. This proof of concept worked, and in 2015, Eggers would finally release his first feature-length film, which captured that old-school folklore history that he grew up so fascinated by and showed a crazy strong commitment to historical accuracy, thematic exploration of sexual repression and religious pressures, and a deep understanding of how to build an oppressive horror atmosphere and well-earned scares, all brought to life with fairy tale-like imagery and a visual style reminiscent of the artwork from the period. Eggers initially wanted to shoot the film in New England, as this is where the story takes place, but due to budget restrictions and tax incentives, production primarily took place in Canada. Working with a $3.5 million budget, The Witch is a prime example of the difference between compromising your vision and compromising to achieve your vision, because what this crew was able to pull off with the money they were working with is quite frankly astounding. Everything was meticulously researched and painstakingly crafted to accurately reflect the time period, and it's a testament to that commitment that the main inaccuracies boil down to this dog breed being incorrect, the corn shocks not being something that was commonplace in the region at the time, and there are more candles lit in the house than realistically there would have been. Those are the main exceptions here, with everything else from the structural designs of the houses, the insanely detailed costume design, the language, the behaviors, and the cultural expectations. They're all period accurate. I am not nearly well versed enough in history to be able to pick all of these details up, but even with my rudimentary knowledge and research for this video, I'm just absolutely blown away by how much thought went into these elements, and that's how to properly allocate a budget. The film was shot digitally, which was a compromise made for the sake of the budget, and it's something that Eggers has not done since and probably will never do again, as film stock definitely suits his style more. The Witch is a movie that has gotten better for me every single time I've sat down to watch it, despite going through it at least once a year since its release, and it's a movie that would undoubtedly make a list of my all-time favorite films, so let's take a look at what makes The Witch a modern folk horror masterpiece, despite Eggers' own insistence that it's overrated.
I be the witch of the wood. Liar. Liar.
I am.
Listen not to him.
Religion was at the core of society in these days, dictating much of how people functioned and being leveraged within government, and Puritanism was a particularly strict Christian religion that wanted to purify the Church of Roman Catholicism, feeling that they were too lax with their enforcement of traditional guidelines.
That damned church.
There is no hither.
Well, what need we? Silver chalices?
William's outward beliefs as a separatist leads the family to being banished from the plantation, and they take their belongings off to the wilderness, cast out to survive on their own without the supports of a settlement. Jaron Blaschke has been Eggers' go-to cinematographer for every film in his career so far, and it's not hard to see why they've stuck together for so long, because right away, The Witch has an absolutely striking visual style, with nearly every single shot in the movie looking like an old painting. Shooting on film definitely would have been a better fit for the movie, but considering they had to work around the very clean look of the digital cinematography, it's very impressive how organic they managed to make the movie look and feel. A lot of that is certainly thanks to the stellar costume and set designs, but it also largely has to do with the decisions made in terms of lighting, color palette, and composition, and the results are just stunning. It reminds me a lot of Andrew Wyeth's paintings, who's one of my favorite artists, and every time I watch the movie, I find myself appreciating more and more just how bleakly gorgeous it is. One of the best shots of the movie is them rolling on their carriage into the woods after leaving the plantation, where it almost starts to look like they're fading and blending into the very forest itself. Other shots like them sitting around a fire not long after, the scene at the dinner table, when the kids are listening in on their parents' conversations, when Thomasin removes her garments at the end of the movie, and especially this shot, which I'm going to talk about later, all of these look like you'd see them as paintings hanging up in a historical museum, and it's one of the things that makes The Witch stand out. The film was shot in a 1.66:1 aspect ratio, which is a taller aspect ratio than most films are usually shot in. This isn't just some unmotivated decision to give the film a unique look, it's something that was intentionally done because these taller ratios do a better job at emphasizing both the height of things, but also can create a more claustrophobic feel for interior scenes. The way the forest looks is made more effective because of how that aspect ratio makes the trees feel like they're stretching higher above the characters, almost looking like these old withered fingers of the witch stretching up from the dirt and into the gray sky. Point is, the movie is just an absolute treat to look at. It doesn't take long for the historical accuracy that has been a focal point of Eggers' career to be plainly apparent either, and while I'm not going to go through every example of this because again, I'm not well versed enough to do so, and I'm not sure how interesting of a video that would make, I do want to point something out here that I think is a good reflection of how this sort of thing was handled throughout the film. The men and women here are split down the middle of the court, standing on opposite sides of the room, but some of the younger boys are standing with the women, which is accurate to how this would have been at the time. We see that same sort of division later when they sit at the dinner table, and there are so many little details in the day-to-day functions of the homestead that lend themselves really well to a sense of realism and immersion within the time period. The film's accuracy has been heavily praised by historians, and even as someone who doesn't know a ton about it, I find that these details go a long way in getting me invested in the world. Last thing I want to touch on before getting more into the film's story is the absolutely beautiful, poetic writing style present in the film.
I love Caleb.
Yeah, and who then found him? Pale as death, naked as sin and witched.
Many period pieces will alter the language spoken from what it would have been at the time to try and make it more palatable and easier to follow for modern audiences, since language changes so much over time and they don't want people having to fight to understand what's being said. That's not something that has ever been a priority in Eggers' work, and the dialogue in this movie is very much reflective of how people would have spoken in this time. And man, how I wish modern language was even half as poetic as some of the dialect that used to be commonplace.
How dare you chide me in a cup? 'Tis not for vanity that I am grieved of it.
Like, instead of stop saying that fuck shit, why can't we say,
Must I hear the devil wag his tongue in thy mouth?
not only is that more poetic, it's also just way cooler. This kind of writing is very hard for actors to perform because as the dialect isn't intrinsic to how we speak now, it leaves essentially no room for improvising and requires perfect memorization of the exact wording in the script, which makes it all the more impressive that we have these very young actors delivering on such demanding performances. It does mean that the meaning of some lines or even entire conversations will be lost on viewers, at least on the first go around, but it also rewards being very attentive and invested and provides a lot of rewatch value since you'll be picking up more every time you see it. Something that's very important to me in period pieces is not adjusting the behaviors, beliefs, or values of the characters to make them more approachable for cultural norms in modern times. And not only does Eggers unabashedly present characters as they would be during the time period his films are set in, but I also love that he takes the time and does the research to make sure they speak in the way they would as well, sometimes directly lifting lines from period-relevant texts, like that great line I just mentioned. Alright, well, with all that covered, let's take a look at the story of the film and how it presents the old folklore of witchcraft and deep-seated religious fear. The Witch is a simple story, following this family in the wake of the loss of their youngest child and watching as things progressively worsen as the family is torn apart by the darkness in these woods. Throughout the course of the film, this disheveled family is tormented and manipulated by the witch that stole Sam, and the context of that scene is very important in establishing the overarching through line that results in Thomasin being left in a vulnerable enough position that she can be drawn into the darkness. Sam was taken under Thomasin's supervision, and throughout the course of the film, when horrible things like this happen, she's in a position that makes her seem at fault for them, and with these seeds of witchcraft being planted in the minds of the family from the beginning, she's accused of communing with the devil herself, tearing apart her family from the inside to prove her worth. While she is innocent of the things she's being blamed for, her introduction on the homestead establishes her as a sinner, at least in thought.
I confess I've lived in sin.
Repression is a core part of what's being explored in the movie, which is something that was also a huge focal point of Eggers' second film, The Lighthouse.
If I had a steak, I would fuck it.
Natural parts of human nature have historically been something deeply feared and marred by threats of eternal hellfire if they're indulged, but by pushing down our intrinsic nature, what's essentially happening is the same thing that would happen if you try and compress too much sand into a plastic bag. Eventually, the bag is going to break and the sand will come pouring out through the tears. Anya Taylor-Joy was cast in the film because Eggers felt like there was no way that she could have been a Puritan, and that feeling of being out of place is very important for the character as she's slowly pushed towards accepting another way of life at the end of the movie. She's wanting more than to be shipped off to another family to mother children, but her deep religious upbringing has taught her that she can't turn her back on those wifely duties. In a lot of ways, distinct personalities of individuals didn't play much of a role in people's lives, as everyone was born with their lives laid out for them because of how much harsher surviving in the world was in these days, and because there were such strict rules about how men and women were expected to behave throughout the course of their lives. This is, of course, completely antithetical to how we understand humans to function now, but paving your way in life and finding your own unique path to follow was simply not something that people were permitted to explore in these days, both out of religious fear for urges that were considered deeply sinful, and also because of the expectation that everyone must contribute in a very specific way to society. That repression of human nature isn't only clear in Thomasin's character, but also in her younger brother Caleb, who we see grappling with his hormonal teenage thoughts and not knowing what he's meant to do with them, feeling only shame. His story is very much focused on sexual repression, as this introduction to his character establishes, and it's then later expanded upon when he's seduced by the witch deep in the forest into engaging in sinful activities, essentially tainting his being in the process, which is represented by him having bit of the apple and seeing it rotten and deathly. One of my favorite scenes of the movie is a conversation between Caleb and William while they're out hunting, where Caleb is seeking answers about original sin. Samuel had not yet been baptized at the time of his death, and so Caleb is horrified by the thought that his baby brother is now cursed to burn in hellfire for all eternity despite never committing a sinful act in his life, and this makes him deeply fearful of what would happen to him if he were to die because he has been engaging with sin in thought. The idea that a newborn baby is somehow intrinsically evil and deserving of eternal torture if they're not purified is, quite honestly, a horrific thought, and it's so unsettling to see William essentially tell him to let it go and focus on his own prayer.
Fain would I tell thee that Sam sleeps in Jesus, that thou wilt, that I will. But I cannot tell thee that.
In these days, families were instructed to not make close bonds with their children until they turned 4 years old, since the world was so unforgiving and children often died before they reached that age. So up to that point, the idea was to raise the kids from a functional perspective as opposed to an emotional one. This isn't a repression as a result of religious restrictions like many of the others are, but instead one that comes from the simple fact that life was far harsher in these days, but it still has that similar effect of forcing people to hold back parts of themselves that really can't be held. That's looking at things from a more broad thematic perspective, but in terms of the forward-facing story that we're experiencing, the family is having a tough time making life work for them outside of the plantation, primarily in regards to their crops and the health of their animals. Their yields are not working out, winding up rotten or black with sickness, and in William's desperation, he decides to secretly sell a chalice that Catherine kept from her father. When it goes missing, her blame is directed towards Thomasin before anyone else, which is a really great example early on of how Catherine blames Thomasin for Sam's disappearance and how she's apt to blame her very quickly when things go wrong in the future, which is a very important part of the story. He does eventually confess to selling the chalice to support the family, but by this point that blame has already been seated in Thomasin, and his confession comes during another moment where Thomasin seems to be guilty of something happening with another one of the kids, so it unfortunately doesn't do much to help ease things out between Thomasin and Catherine.
I took thy father's cup. I sold it.
One of the main elements of the casting decisions with this movie is that most of the actors were relatively unknown at the time, which helped with the budget restrictions, but also made it so that it would be more likely that an audience would have no associations with the actors' faces outside of the characters they were playing. This has, of course, not remained the case, as the cast in this film has gone on to become much more recognizable, but the casting decisions are so good even without that lack of outside association. Ralph Ineson and Kate Dickie have very puritanistic faces and fall into the period easily, and Joy's softer features and bright blonde hair do make her feel very out of place in this family of harsher faces with dark hair. Of course, it's not just their looks that went into their casting, as the performances from everyone are absolutely nothing less than stunning.
I made no
The
bargain.
devil hath no interest in thee.
I am no witch, Father.
What did I but see in my house?
There is so much weight given to every increasingly dark moment of the film thanks to what this cast delivered, and their performances alongside the often long, breathing scenes create such a strong sense of immersion and believability. Casting child actors can be tricky, and you risk hurting the immersion if it doesn't work out well, but Ellie Granger and Lucas Dawson both did fantastic jobs with their characters. Oh, and of course, Ralph Ineson has the pinnacle of human voice production, which definitely helps a lot. So what of this elusive witch? We don't actually see her very much, and the moments where we do are often short and quite dark, making it difficult to ever fully get an idea of what she looks like, which helps build up a great eerie quality to her presence. While we don't see her much, she's felt throughout the entire film, not just because of the oppressive atmosphere or the bleak events, but also thanks to the very traditional symbolism associated with witches. For example, hares were often tied together with them, with some thinking that witches could shapeshift into hares, and throughout the film, there's one that seems to be almost taunting the family with food, like the witch is dangling their survival in front of them but never letting them get their hands on it. Those portrayals of old beliefs about witchcraft are a huge part of what I love so much about this movie, another one being what's done with Sam after he's taken. It was believed that witches would coat their poles in the blood of unbaptized babies, allowing them to fly on them, and it's one hell of a scene to have early on in the movie. It's the most grotesque sequence of the whole thing, with some of the most unsettling imagery of the witch herself as she goes through this horrifying ritual, closing off in one of my favorite shots in all of horror, where she begins floating up towards the moon through the rickety branches on the dead trees and then morphs into looking like a raven silhouetted in the middle of the frame. It's an eerily gorgeous shot that feels so dreamlike, selling that connection that this witch has with something outside of our world really well in a very short period of time. There are all sorts of these fairy tale-like images, another one of my favorites being right when Sam is kidnapped and we see the witch running through the woods in a red cloak, obviously reflecting the Little Red Riding Hood story in a twisted way, but on top of that, it's also just an insanely creepy looking shot. During these scenes of the supernatural, Eggers and Blasky chose to shoot them at either 27 or 29 frames per second as opposed to the traditional 24, which, when contrasted against the rest of the film being shot in that traditional frame rate, gives them a dreamlike quality that really separates the tone of these moments from the rest. Throughout most of the movie, these scenes use 27 frames per second, but they go up to 29 in the final scene to really push that feeling as far as it's going to go, making that conclusion feel utterly otherworldly. Part of the reasoning behind wanting these scenes to feel dreamlike is that a lot of the imagery in the movie was inspired by dreams that Eggers had as a kid, with moments like when the witch is in the barn at the end of the movie being pretty much a straight rip from recurring nightmares, so this creative decision was a way to reflect that feeling. Outside of the witch herself and her manifestation as this haunting hare, there is the star of the show, Black Phillip, a goat who is, for all intents and purposes, the devil himself. One of the main points of manipulation within this his family comes from Black Phillip gaining the trust of the two youngest children, whispering in their ears when no one is around. Children are easily manipulated, and while they surely could have been convinced to take part in some horrible act, the primary reason that they're being used here is to make Thomasin look even more guilty. Black Phillip plants these ideas into the kids' heads, knowing that they'll eventually repeat some of what they're being told, and that will help strengthen the wedge between Thomasin and the rest of the family. I've been talking lots about this manipulation to isolate Thomasin from the love of her family and make her more open to accepting a life led by the devil, and if there's any one scene where her fate is sealed, it's Caleb's death, which is potentially the best scene of the whole movie. The previous morning, Caleb woke up before anyone else to go off into the woods and try to hunt to prove himself as a man and provide for his struggling family, but Thomasin catches him and convinces him to let her come along, otherwise she'll go and tell her parents about what he's doing.
If you don't let me along with you, I'll wake Mother and Father this instant.
They share one of very few tender scenes here, wandering through the woods and talking about memories from earlier on in life.
Remember once he lay upon the table, and Father saw him and he said, "We will have him for meat. Kate, we will roast this beast."
Despite Caleb being too young at the time to remember what she's talking about, it's a very sweet and honest scene that goes a long way to making the sibling relationship between these two feel more believable.
I remember that day, but no glass.
It's a nice touch, too, that this is one of few scenes in the movie where there's a nice sunny glow, helping to emphasize the glimmer of comfort in this bleak world. Sun is very uncommon in the movie, with the only other prominent example of it being when they first arrive on the homestead early on with all their wildest dreams laid out in front of them, which, of course, isn't a long-lasting light. It seems to be set in stone that no warmth is to last very long in this movie, as this tender moment is also cut short when their dog goes chasing after the hare. Caleb follows, and the horse is scared, causing it to throw Thomasin off and knock her out, and Caleb is then lost to the woods and drawn in by the dark seduction of the witch. This isn't only another situation where Thomasin was the only person around when something goes wrong with another kid. It also means that the family has now been left without their horse or their gun, leaving them more stranded and without the ability to properly defend themselves, or hunt for food for that matter. Caleb shows back up later in the night, Thomasin being the one that finds him, once again creating more questions about her honesty with the family and the nature of her character in their eyes. What follows the next morning is a scene that is nothing less than absolutely breathtaking, beginning with the harrowing screams of pain coming from Caleb in the upper loft of the house. Harvey Scrimshaw may not have been all that interested in doing this movie, only taking the audition because he was at the mall with his mother and given the decision between going shoe shopping or doing this random audition, and he didn't want to go shoe shopping. But holy sweet hell, is this one of the most impressive things I have ever seen from an actor of his age. This scene is an absolute endurance test, with something like 17 pages of script to go through and an insanely long and complex monologue asked of Scrimshaw as his character goes through this chilling experience. Caleb was had by dark magic and is now fading away in a roller coaster of a scene where he goes from screaming in agony to a more joyous state, seeming to be in the presence of the divine as he fades. There's the very unsettling thought that he's only being shown what he sees as the sight of his lord to taunt him before pulling him into hellfire for falling into the witch's trap, and it's equally cruel for the false hope that it gives his family that he may be okay after the love of the Lord reached out and helped him. The monologue is absolute poetry, as is most of the writing in the film, and it's the sheer intensity and unpredictability of what's happening that gives the scene so much weight. It's an absolutely heartbreaking thing to watch as his parents go from terrified by what's happening to forming a prayer circle to try and save him, thinking it worked as he begins to show this touch of God, and then being absolutely devastated when he ultimately falls away from them. The look on William's face here of relief and hope and joy makes it so much worse, and then Catherine shrieks as she realizes what's happened. It's a stunning sequence, full stop, and I always find myself tearing up, not just from the emotionality of the scene itself, but just from how insanely intense and well done it is. Another interesting detail here is how the twins seem to be tied into whatever's happening with Caleb, the first sign of that being that they can't remember their prayers, which is already a really eerie detail, and then as they mirror what's happening to him, it's made clear that through their communication with Black Phillip, they've become intertwined with the darkness in the forest. What the exact nature of their involvement is never spelled out to us, but it seems that they've certainly been compelled by and connected to the witch's power. They accuse Thomasin of bewitching Caleb and being behind all of the horrible things that have happened because Black Phillip told them she was, and also because of a jest from Thomasin earlier in the movie where she was taking her frustrations out on Mercy by scaring the shit out of her and pretending to be the one responsible for Sam's disappearance. Continuing on with the absolute perfection of this sequence, Thomasin runs outside and is followed by William, who catches her by a little bush and has what's probably my favorite interaction of the film. At first, it seems as if he may believe her side of the story and doesn't think she's the one responsible for what's been happening, as he speaks very tenderly to her.
This tree will be lovely come spring. Such a pretty tree.
That line there, I'm sounding like a bit of a broken record there, also always brings a tear to my eye because it highlights so much of the tragedy in what's happened. It brings to mind those little pretty things in life that don't always get the attention they should, and the sadness of it is that it's just this barren assortment of thin branches during this season. They are so far away from the warmth of the world, and I'm very struck by just how well that one line paints a broad picture of the film's story. It also calls back to a conversation from earlier on where Catherine talks about how far away from the love of Christ she feels, and the way William closes that conversation is so deeply eerie and very revealing of the life perspective people had in these days.
I fear I cannot ever feel that same measure of love again.
Thou shalt have of it in heaven.
I'm reading a lot into a fucking bare bush, aren't I? Anyway, the point of the scene isn't that William believes Thomasin. It's quite the opposite, actually, and the core of what's happening here is what makes him my favorite character in the movie.
I love Caleb.
Yeah, and who then found him? Pale as death, naked as sin and witched.
There's no quick switch where she's thrown out to the woods for what her family believe her to be guilty of, but instead, William's fatherly side takes hold and he wants to try and turn Thomasin around from the path he believes her to be on, speaking softly to her to try and appeal to whatever may be left of the young girl he raised. It's a bone-chilling scene as William pleads for his daughter to stay in the light of God, but she manages to turn things around and tell him about all of the strange behaviors from the twins, calling into question everything about what's going on here.
Mercy told me herself by the stream, I be the witch of the wood.
Unable to find the answers he needs, William boards the remaining children in the barn and says they'll be returning to the plantation tomorrow and whatever needs to be sorted out will be, but unbeknownst to him, he's just sealed their tomb. As I briefly mentioned earlier, one of those recurring nightmares that Eggers had as a child was of a witch kneeled over in a dark corner, and when he approached, she would turn around and begin a dreadful cackle, which is when he would jolt awake, and we see something very similar to this happen with the twins, who are then nowhere to be found in the morning. Before that happens though, there's a gut-wrenching sequence where these two broken parents have to bury their son, and with that comes one of my favorite shots in film. This is just absolutely stunning in every way, with a close runner-up being this one of the kids listening in on their parents earlier on when they were talking about how Thomasin has come of age and needs to begin pursuing her family. Please let Robert and Jaren continue working together forever because this is just goddamn art right here. Catherine climbs into the grave, and apparently the look on William's face here had every parent on set in tears. It's a really powerful moment that's just so insanely bleak. Back to the next morning where the twins are gone, the goats have been torn to shreds, and Thomasin is left on her own, sitting in the shambles of this horrible sight and looking like she was guilty of all of it the whole time. To make things even more tragic, William dies right after this, meaning that his final moments in life were the false realization that his daughter had killed all of her siblings and is now one with the devil. You can't not be badass going out though.
Corruption. Thou art my father.
Metal as fuck. While I think Caleb's death is probably the best scene of the movie, I think my favorite may be this monologue from William the night before he dies, where he's so overwhelmed by the feeling of failing his family and losing them to darkness because of his stance as a Puritan separatist and unwillingness to abide by the laws of the settlement they were in. It's a hauntingly tragic prayer where he's begging God to save his family, no matter what he has to pay in return.
And I'll lick the dust of thine earth.
It's heartbreaking and also eerily beautiful to watch him collapse in the dirt, bathed in ghostly moonlight, and beg for the grace he feels he's deprived his family of.
I beg thee, my Christ, I have not damned my family.
William is a good father, as Catherine is a good mother who's been driven past the point she's able to handle. During that same night, she sees visions of everything she so deeply desires, back in her life once again. Samuel has been found, Caleb is standing there with him, her father's silver cup is by her side. All is well. wow. She's being taunted by visions of joy, only for it all to be ripped from her as this evil feeds off her very body. Her death is what I would call the most disturbing scene of the movie, where she's just completely broken upon coming outside to this horrifying sight, and she tries to kill Thomasin in her despair. What makes this so tough to watch, on top of how inherently unsettling a mother attacking her child like this is Thomasin's repeated pleading of, "I love you," throughout the whole thing. The love of her mother has been stolen from her falsely, and she's just trying to hold on to whatever she can of this here while her mother doesn't feel any of it anymore. She brutally chops at her mother's face on the brink of death, taking her over the final step that needed to happen in order for her to be willing to accept the offer she's about to be made. That loss of innocence is represented by her stripping off her garments, showing how she's essentially ridding herself of the confines of Puritan society that she's lived within her whole life and leaving herself exposed to other influences to take its place. She seeks out Black Phillip that night, knowing that there is some dark magic within the goat after seeing how it affected the twins and wanting to find whatever acceptance she can. And the devil manifests as this very opulent looking figure to compel her more into a life of riches. The final scene of the movie shows Thomasin walking into the woods, with another one of my favorite shots being this one where it looks like she's almost floating up to the trees since it's too dark for us to see the ground, and all we see is her ghostly pale outline going higher into the darkness. She wanders into the moonlit forest and finds in it a coven of witches dancing naked around a fire, chanting into the night sky. Thomasin, having signed the devil's book and accepting herself into the coven, floats into the sky along with the others. The Witch is, at the end of the day, not meant to be much more than a vignette of what was essentially every Puritan's worst nightmare, taking every fear this culture had and painting it in vivid, dreamy detail. One of the biggest elements of this is the all-timer score from Mark Corvin, whose praises I have been singing since I saw this movie and who has continued to deliver some of the best horror movie music in modern filmmaking, both thanks to his wonderfully twisted mind, but also because of this bizarre instrument he calls the apprehension engine, which I've talked about on the channel before because I'm absolutely obsessed with it. On top of taking advantage of the hauntingly nightmarish sounds this thing can create, he also made use of some very traditional instruments such as the nyckelharpa, a Swedish bowed instrument that also uses keys to give it a very unique sound. The juhiko was also used, a Finnish 2- or 3-stringed lyre, and much of the vocals in the soundtrack were actually black magic chants. That's awesome. It's a chilling score that helps to bring to life the deeply historical and witchly feel of the movie, and not only using traditional instrumentation to further immerse in the film's tone, but also very old school melodies and progressions. It's amazing, inject it into my veins and play it at my funeral. I could listen to What Went We on repeat for all eternity, I think. This is one of those movies that many have said is just nothing happening for an hour and a half, and I couldn't disagree more with that sentiment. Despite its simple idea, this is an insanely detailed and gripping depiction of all of the worst fears of Puritan society, packed with breathtaking performances, crazy attention to detail, great dynamics between the characters that evolve in interesting ways, and some of the most beautiful historical cinematography I've ever seen. Watching the violent decimation of this family from the inside is a harrowing experience, and it's also poetically portrayed with a competence that is quite frankly absurd for a first-time feature film. I also love that despite the film's overall straightforward approach to displaying a Puritan nightmare, there's also the little hint that maybe what happened here was a result of their tainted crops, as we do see ergot fungus on some of them. It's not an angle that's expanded upon beyond that little nod, but I love that it's there because it leaves a little what if idea floating around. The Witch is not only one of my favorite horror movies of all time, but one of my favorite movies, period. The sheer artistry and respect for folklore is something that is very rarely seen, especially when dealing with witches who have become more comical than anything else these days. What makes it even more impressive is that this movie uses very classical traits of witches, with the old hag portrayal and flying on brooms, not quite brooms actually. They were traditionally just poles, and that's what we see here. There's also things like the characteristic cackling, the Red Riding Hood motifs. It's all here, and it's very impressive to see that Eggers was able to take these traits that have been presented comically for so long and make them scary again by turning the camera into the eyes of someone in Puritan times and showing how deeply frightening witches were. This is one of those movies where I finish it and my first thought is always just like, well, what the hell is going to be able to follow that up? It's just phenomenal, and being Eggers' first full-length feature is wild. I have no issues in saying that this is my favorite folk horror movie ever made, and my favorite depiction of witchcraft in film.
Oh my God. I am full.
Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.